A good topic for the study of diversity is the basics of culture from a sociological standpoint. Culture really has a lot to do with much of the misperceptions and confusion that exists in societies today, particularly those that are blending different cultures into one society. And so it's just a good idea to take a few moments to look at some of the basic concepts of this so that we're all talking about the same thing. It's a very important factor in understanding social behavior, and essentially culture is considered to be the sum of knowledge, ideas, values, and material objects that are passed from generation to generation. Certain kinds of behaviors, patterns of behaviors, are established by the culture, and they're enforced by what we call norms, which are the shared expectations and rules that guide our behavior. Now, these norms oftentimes are explicit, at other times they're implicit and understood. And oftentimes when persons violate norms, it is because that perhaps that they haven't been made as explicit as they should have been. Now, there are different kinds of norms, and this list here really looks at them from in terms of gradation from the least serious to the most serious. So a folkway is sometimes referred to as customs, which really is the least serious of the norms, although they're this very pervasive, but they're very conventional rules of everyday life. And violating a folkway generally carries the least amount of sanctions, although it'll probably get some attention, but not much in terms of consequence for a violation. An example might be sitting at the dinner table and letting out a loud belch, for instance. That's generally not accepted in American culture. Also, another example of a folkway has to do with walking down the hallway or walking down a street. If you've ever noticed this, generally, at least in our culture, when two people are approaching each other and will collide if they don't change their path, they'll tend to step to the right. And that's something that if you want to see what happens when you violate a folkway, just step to the left sometimes when that comes to you, and you see what kind of things occur. Another example of a folkway is men walking around without shirts on. Now, that depends upon the situation, of course, but generally speaking, shirtless males are considered acceptable in society. Shirtless females, however, are not, and shirtless females would really fall under the category of amore, which are much stronger norms that tend to reflect what we consider to be moral values in a society. And the penalty for violating those mores tends to be much heavier. Another example is nudity, public nudity. There are places where, like nude beaches, for instance, where nudity is acceptable, but by and large, public nudity is a more in our society and not acceptable, oftentimes even within households, for that matter. In other cultures, nudity within a family is something that's very easily accepted and understood, but is less so, I believe, in American culture at least. Interesting little twist to this. As you see at the bottom, what I say is what is considered deviant in one culture is considered acceptable in others. And a good example of that might be nudity within a family. But within any culture also, sometimes the context specifies whether something is acceptable or not. An example of something that is nudity being an example of something that's generally never acceptable in public, but the phenomena of streaking, if you're familiar with that, which tends to occur when there's a lot going on in society and we need something to take our minds off of it. When I was in undergraduate training, the Vietnam War was going on and there were all sorts of cultural chaos occurring and everything like this. And there was a spike in streaking going on in public situations. And I suddenly in a cafeteria, for instance, some guy would go running. Usually he'd have a ski mask over his face so nobody knew he was, but just go running through the crowd. And the response to that would be people laughing and standing and cheering and clapping their hands. But over time, that became less acceptable, and there was an example actually at Skyview High School. This was a big item in the paper in the Peninsula Clarion some years ago where somebody streaked during halftime of a football game, and they eventually figured out who it was, and it was a student, and he was suspended for a 15-day period, and there was a great debate in the community about whether or not he should have been suspended or not. Some people considered it to be a sexual violation even, that exposing himself to little children who were in attendance at the game. Other people just really laughed and thought it was funny. Now take that kind of public nudity and put it in a situation like somebody ambling down the hallway in your classroom building in the middle of the day, or walking into the post office with a ski mask on and no clothing otherwise. The person would get arrested and hauled off. So you see, context, it has something to do with what's acceptable and what isn't also as far as norms are concerned, at least in terms of the response to violations of norms. A taboo is a norm that really is much more serious than a moray, and feelings are so strong about these behaviors that people are disgusted when somebody breaks a taboo. And usually that person is really considered to be banished from society, is not fit to live in society. An example in American society would be, sexual abuse of children. Sexual molesters, many people in society would like to see them put into prison, just totally banished from society for life. It doesn't happen, but that is the response to that. Other examples of taboos might include incest or cannibalism. If you've ever listened to or saw the movie Alive, or read the book, which is much better than the movie, about the story of the young soccer team, the players that crashed in the Andes and were stuck in the mountains for, 60 to 90 days or something like that, and had to resort eventually to eating people that were killed in the crash in order to survive. If you follow up that story, there are books written by some of the survivors about the difficulty they had in readjusting to society, and the guilt and shame they felt for having done this, even though that was the only way they could survive. And this is an example of what happens when you break a taboo and sometimes forced to do so in order for survival's sake. It's a story that's worth following and looking into. Another example of a taboo, for instance, in a Muslim religion, for many individuals are not allowed to eat pork, and there's a strong response to that in the Muslim world as well. And then laws, which is something we're really, of course, quite familiar with, which is really the formalization of mores and folkways in a society, driving while intoxicated or breaking in and entering and those kinds of things, where there are limits placed upon behaviors in order to protect individuals from impulses of others. But again, I want to stress that the term deviant, which generally has a very negative connotation to it, is really a neutral term, and it means that an individual is varying from the standards of behavior in a culture. It's just doing something outside the norm. That's what a deviant behavior is, and it's not innately a negative act, except as it is defined by the culture or the group in which it occurs. So keeping that in mind sometimes might help you consider that in some cultures, what we consider to be unacceptable behavior in others may not be. Another concept of the study of cultures are subcultures, and these are groups within a given culture whose beliefs, norms, and values differ some from the primary culture, but they still remain a part of the larger culture. Whereas a counterculture is a group within a culture that consciously rejects features of the larger culture, and members will try to separate themselves from the larger culture. Now, an example of a subculture might be, a Chinatown or a Little Italy, and those kinds of things, where there are differences perhaps in how things are done within that particular culture, and yet they're still a member of the larger culture. A good example of a counterculture was the hippie movements of the 1960s, where the individuals involved in that movement really tried to separate themselves from the larger culture and live on their own. When we look at other cultures, we do tend to use our own culture as what is normal, as sort of the standard, the yardstick by which we judge others' person's cultures, and this is what we call ethnocentrism. In its extreme form, ethnocentrism would be xenophobia, and so virtually every culture, as this points out, has some ethnocentricity in its thinking, because each culture tends to see themselves as superior in the correct way of seeing the world, and judge other cultures measured against their own view of the world. And of course, this is the basis for the difference between groups, and dominant groups often use the tendency of ethnocentrism and even xenophobia to discriminate and marginalize minority groups within a culture. So norms, which can become a part of our being as once we're taught this from an early age. They're enforced by both negative and positive sanctions. That's rewards and punishments. In psychological terms, right, a sanction is a reward or a punishment or a response to a behavior. It can be a positive or a negative sanction. But when a person comes from a different culture and comes into a new culture, there tends to be a good deal of confusion about norms and expectations because they vary from culture to culture. And the dominant culture tends to use negative sanctions as a result of this confusion. The labeling of persons who engage in behaviors because they're confused about what is proper and what is correct. And the person new to the culture may never come to understand why they experience the negative sanctions. And so it's important to keep this in mind again, that this is how the majority culture tends to respond to violations of its norms by individuals coming from other lands and other cultures. And as I mentioned earlier, these norms vary from culture to culture and also don't always apply equally to all groups in any one society as well. So these norms and values that dictate what is normal for the culture must be taught to the younger generation. And so the adult's responsibility is to do what we call socializing or teaching these norms and values to their children. Now, this socialization in the norms of society isn't just about what parents do. It also has to do with what institutions within the society preach and do, such as religion, such as education, such as the media. All of these institutions within the society have a part in socializing the young person as well. In fact, it's said oftentimes that the role of the public school system and the educational system within America is less about teaching knowledge and skills and more about socializing the children into culture. So if internalization and socialization fail to produce conformity, that failure to conform, of course, is deviance, then some form of social control is eventually needed, and depends upon the culture, depends upon the situation, depends upon who's in charge and what the offense is, but this can take the form of discipline by parents. It can take the form of fines and punishments and imprisonment if parents don't intervene, or if the person's too old to be managed by parents. Some societies in some cultures ostracize individuals for violating the norms of their group. For instance, some Amish sects will ostracize, we call shun, those individuals who refuse to join the church after a certain period of time. Some societies will banish persons to other lands for violations of norms. Native villages sometimes will banish individuals from the community or banish. There have been instances where societies in Southeast Alaska also use banishment as a form of discipline or response to law violations. And it's, I think, a more traditional kind of response to such things among indigenous groups. We'll be reading about that later in the semester. Our values are another important part of the culture, and we've talked about values in the past week, and we'll continue to do that during the semester. But some of the most universal American values, some of those that were included in the discussion on the Phyllis Day material, also include other things like freedom and equality, achievement, hard work, charity. Another emerging American value is leisure. It's becoming something that's important. But all of these values supposedly apply equally to everybody, even though our talents and our personal circumstances are very unequal in this society. And really, it may be less that our talents are unequal as it is our circumstances are unequal. The opportunity doesn't exist evenly among all members of society. And because of this uneven access to quality education, effective job training, good employment opportunities that have advancement opportunities, those kinds of things, the necessary resources in a society to be successful are often blocked. And so a person is unable to live these values. And this, of course, applies particularly for the populations that we're studying this semester in many respects. A very important part of any culture is its language. It's been said that if there isn't a word for something, that something doesn't exist. And so words are very important. And this is something that, they carry a significance to them that I think is becoming more and more apparent to Americans in recent years as well. Culture itself is primarily transmitted through the language. We teach our young, we socialize our young with the use of words and language and things, and so it can be, in many respects, as much a determinant of culture and therefore of reality as it is a part of the culture. Having hosted several exchange students from overseas over the years, one of the emphases of the exchange program that I hosted with, that was Youth for Understanding, was that the exchange student was to use their native language as little as possible during the course of the year. In order to encourage this, one of the things they did was to try to limit the amount of contact the student had with parents during the year, but that was less successful than and there are a lot of problems associated with that. But for instance, when we had gatherings where the exchange students would get together, there would almost always be a fairly large number of German students in the group, and there was always a rule that the Germans were supposed to speak English to each other, not German. And that wasn't because anybody was afraid that they were talking about other people, but because it was the feeling that in order to be immersed in the culture, the American language, which was the English language, was essential to that immersion. And that was the whole point of the exchange, was to have the student immersed in the culture during the course of the year. So that was an acknowledgement of the importance of language. Studies say that the language we speak predisposes us to interpret our world in very specific ways. And that the population, the use of a language by a population often reflects the unique experiences of the population. And this is one of the things that leads to the differences in our worldview. It's the old standard example in this particular area is the fact that apparently, at least, that in some of the Alaska Native languages there are over 100 different terms used to refer to snow. Now, that may be an exaggeration. I don't know. Students in the class may be able to tell me differently, but that's an example of the fact that weather in the far north and in rural areas where there aren't roads and the kinds of things that others are used to living in urban environments, that weather is so much more important, that there are so many different ways to describe it, much more than there are in many other languages in the area. Within any culture, there's a difference between what are the theoretical norms and values of society and what is actually applied. And that's the difference between the ideal culture and the real culture. This conflict between ideal culture and real culture is something that is the basis for a lot of discussion in the political and social conversations that are going on at this time in America, as we find many things challenged in just in the daily news, for that matter. Cultural change results from such phenomena as cultural borrowing, diffusion, and discovery. Discovery is a sudden recognition. There are elements that have always been there, but to put them together in different ways, and that's a discovery. Invention and history. So cultural borrowing is really an exchange of elements of a culture through trade. Oftentimes, we share culture, we spread our culture through the use of trade and exchange. And cultural diffusion is more to the sharing of aspects of cultures with others around the world. And the internet, for instance, is considered to be a very important agent of cultural diffusion, blurring many of the boundaries that have existed in societies. Some say making it more difficult for leaders to create us against them philosophies, because with the use of internet, at least as long as the internet is free and available, we're able to reach around our leaders and reach around the politicians to communicate with persons from other cultures and learn for ourselves. There's some recognition of this, for instance, in China, where I know my Chinese exchange student contacted me recently and, has really not been able to stay in close touch, partly because Facebook is outlawed in China and Google's also outlawed in China. And so it's much more difficult for him to be able to reach into other societies. And that tells you a little bit about the fact that their leaders recognize just how they're trying to keep control of their culture over there in ways that over time is, I think, not going to be possible. So we talked a little bit about ethnocentrism earlier, that we tend to see our own culture as superior, and this leads to strong feelings of nationalism. And one of the things that this style of leadership does, and I might say is doing, is that it promotes internal connections and supposedly stability. Now, this was a technique that was used by the Nazis. For instance, Hitler used this in garnering the feelings of the Germans against the Jews, and there were other groups that were becoming also ostracized by the Nazis, but didn't go to the extreme that it did with the Jews. And what one of the phenomena that occurred with that is that it strengthened the German community together. It caused them to tighten up, and made it easier for Hitler to lead them. There was a very famous study done by sociologists some years back at a camp. It was you look it up, the Sheriff, SHERIF experiment with creating in-group and out-group loyalties, and how the impact that had upon leadership and getting things done. Ethnocentrism also at the same time then creates barriers to cooperation with persons from outside the culture, and it really tends to block our understanding about social and economic classes, ethnic and racial groups, one generation to the next, all of those kinds of things, because we're very much focused upon our own group, our own culture, our own class. Cultural appropriation is another term that has become more familiar to us lately, and it occurs when cultural elements are copied from minority culture by members of a dominant culture and are used outside of the original cultural context, sometimes even against the expressly stated wishes of members of the originating culture. And an obvious example of that involves the names of mascots of some of the professional sports teams, like the Washington Redskins, for instance. The use of terms that really are considered to be derogatory, and yet are by the larger majority culture appropriated and used in a way that is intended necessarily to be derogatory, but just kind of blows past the fact that it's offensive to members of minority culture. And this is where cultural appropriation comes into play. Now, there are a lot of people who have issue with the concept of cultural appropriation, and you can bet that they're mostly individuals of the majority culture as well. And there's another example that another book that I worked out of once referring to what was called mock Spanish, where individuals made use of certain terms from the Spanish language, kind of making it a part of the English exchange, and somehow implying some sort of superiority in the ability to be able to use this term in a way that necessarily wasn't intended. Things like saying no problemo or hasta la vista baby, and those kinds of things that just things worth thinking about that members of the majority culture don't necessarily tune into, but can sometimes be very troubling to individuals from minority cultures. So cultural relativism is the recognition that each culture is unique and must be judged in its own context, and that one's own norms and values cannot be used to measure the worth of another's culture. What is considered deviant in one culture is acceptable in others. There are those who believe that cultural relativism can be taken too far, and an example of that is female genital mutilation, which is considered a norm in certain cultures, and we would consider backwards cultures in Africa and I think in some parts of the Middle East, and yet is practiced by those cultures as a part of their control of genders, which again is considered unacceptable in other cultures. There are those who say that such acts are so reprehensible that they shouldn't be accepted no matter what culture you live in. So that's a point of discussion. But cultural relativism otherwise is really just the understanding that we have to understand social behavior in its own cultural framework in the context of its own society and not judge it based upon our own standards from within our own society, but only the standards of that particular society. You have the handout made available to you on dimensions of culture, which I find very useful, and I really would encourage you to print it out and keep it handy, or save a copy of it at least, because you can see how here comparing individualist and collectivist cultures, how that really kind of ripples through many different interactions that we have with each other. And I just find some of the specifics in here, in that particular piece of information, is something that's very useful and may help us understand some of the differences between us. But of course, our tendency is to view the world through the lens of the context of our own culture, how we were raised, and again, as Phyllis Day would tell us, things that are a part of the very fabric of our existence and of our being. And unless we understand they're there, and also understand that what we see as reality, what we see as the truth, isn't necessarily what is reality and what is the truth for those who come from other cultures and other ways of life. Unless we really decide to step out of our own frame of reference and learn about other frames of references, it's going to be very difficult for us to work in our field. So this is really the challenge you have ahead of you. Okay, that's my little talk on culture. I hope you find some useful things to ponder here.